Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. The Green Mountain Boy, A Tale of Ticonderoga. In the spring of the year 1776, a troop of horsemen might be seen wending their way down that part of the Green Mountains which lies east of the head of Lake Champlain by the rude and rugged pathway leading to the western plain. Their route lay along the side of Killington Peak, which arose on the site in lonely magnificence to the elevation of several thousand feet above the level of the lake. On the left, less stupendous but partaking of the same wild aspect, were piled heap on heap irregular ridges and immense round-topped eminences covered with forests. The sun had not yet surmounted the eastern summits, and as they passed between the towering walls of rock, sometimes with impending cliffs, at others with the gigantic forest trees forming an arch above their heads, their way was frequently uncheered by a single ray of light, and their course down the perilous precipice was directed only by the voice of the brawling torrent, which fretted and dashed over the successive ledges of the mountain side. Yet still they held on their way, untired and unfaltering. They were generally men of robust and hardy frame, and bold, undaunted bearing. Had they been encountered on the Alps or Apennines, they might have been at first deemed banditti, proceeding to the attack of a monastery or the sack of a village. Yet a closer scrutiny would have discovered in their fearless but frank and ruddy visages no features of the robber or assassin. In the poor and honest region they were traversing, the most romantic imagination could not for an instant place them in the degraded class of freebooters. Yet there was that of the wild and picturesque about them, which, combined with the surrounding scenery, might be worthy of the pencil of Salvator Rosa. What then was their character? They were not mere hunters, for, although several among them carried rifles, many were armed with weapons never used in the chase, while in their general equipment, their order of movement, and silent acquiescence in the directions of individuals recognized as leaders, although without martial insignia, there could be observed a marked military character. Might they not be of those who combined to resist the execution of the mandates of the governor of New York, which, it was well known, had for their object to force the bold and industrious settlers on the Hampshire grants from their hard-earned lands and possessions? This supposition would be strengthened by there being perceived among them more than one who had been already outlawed, and a price set on their heads for their resistance to those arbitrary edicts. This idea, too, appeared to be encouraged by themselves in their brief and passing intercourse with the few inhabitants who had reared their humble cabins on the road they travelled, but not unfrequently a close and confidential whisper between the inquisitive mountaineer and an acquaintance in the troop ended in the former's deliberately taking down his fusee, swinging his cutlass, and mounted on his best horse, proceeding with the cavalcade, leaving the better part of the house, the woman standing at the door in motionless and, what is more extraordinary, mute astonishment. The troop, whatever it might be, passed on at as quick a pace as its numbers and the nature of the ground would allow, and was just entering the gorges of the mountain when a horseman galloped past the main body from rear to front. The stranger was a youth of not more than mere manhood, and of athletic and well-turned limb. Reining up gracefully as he gained the front of the train, he doffed his hat to the leader and slightly bent his head, rich in luxuriant curls, while his fine intelligent features lighted up and his dark expressive eye flashed out the fire of some powerful emotion. "And who may you be, friend?" demanded the leader, with soldier-like bluntness. "A recruit, if you like one; a volunteer, if you accept me," the stranger answered. "One ripe and ready to go hand in hand with the foremost in your enterprise." "And know you what that enterprise is?" "Perfectly. But you are a stranger to me." "Not so to all who go with you. But we waste time. Here are my credentials." The leader took the paper proffered by the volunteer, and glancing over it, extended his hand and welcomed him with a cordial grasp. "Enough," said the volunteer. "If you can trust me, listen to my proposition," and he drew the officer a little in advance of the party. In the short conference that followed, the impatient and fiery youth appeared to be urging a suit with vehemence, and the cool caution of the officer seemed at length to yield either to his argument or impetuosity. Hastily writing a few lines with his pencil on the paper which he still held in his hand, he returned it to the youth, who received it with animation and eagerness, then waving his farewell as he turned his body partially around, dashed forward, and disappeared down the rugged precipice, soon leaving the troop far behind. "I calculate," coolly observed a man of the front rank, "that yon chap doesn't own, out and out, the creature he rides, or he'd scarcely hold his neck so cheap." "You've missed a figure, Hiram," replied his right elbow man, "by reason that his own neck's his own, anyhow, and I'll allow there's but the toss of a copper which goes first, her'n or his'n." "If there's a room to throw in a guess," remarked a third, "I should say that our young fellow's arter a petticoat." "And why so, friend Wagstaff?" asked the leader, who had heard the dialogue. "Is not Glory a mistress, with charms bright enough to attack a man of spirit?" "But don't disremember, captain," replied Wagstaff, "that we're men of flesh too. Glory's a purty article, a dreadful purty article, but at the present I'd a considerable sight rather have a soft bed and a warm companion than to go to Glory over yon precipice with a frosty rock for my resting place." The familiar jests of the men were not repressed by their leader, who knew they proceeded from no feeling of insubordination, but were proofs rather of buoyancy of spirits and contented minds, and while he was assured of their fidelity and devotedness to the cause in which they were engaged, he rather encouraged whatever had a tendency to enliven their march. "It's a rough road we travel, brother," said Hiram after a pause, "and something long." "Short enough, if it leads to a long home," answered Wagstaff. "For my part," observed Hiram, despondingly, "I've never had a brush with anything better than Indians and Yorkers. You have been out among the rig'lars, Jotham." "I know it," replied Jotham Wagstaff. "Sartin I've been where things didn't go so slow. I ask you, where the bullets came desperate fast, that's the gospel on't." "You didn't dodge, though, Jotham?" "We hadn't time, Hiram, but after the blow was over, one fellow said it was ridiculous, he'd curse and quit; another made up his mind to bow his neck and make tracks; and our captain wished a many a time that his commission were in hell, and he were to home. He was a bay man, that captain." "Massachusetts is doing good things now, Jotham," said the leader. "I know it," replied Wagstaff. "They peppered the redbirds well at Lexington, it seems. When are we to have a spoon in the dish, captain? Where are we to join old Ethan?" "Presently, at Rutland possibly, positively at Castleton," answered the captain. "And Fegs?" "There's Rutland now, full ahead," rejoined Wagstaff, as emerging from the defile an extensive prospect spread before him. Hill and valley, field and forest, town and stream, lay in beautiful variety, basked in the first beams of the sun which, having climbed the eastern mountains, poured his rays full upon the landscape, dispersing at once in thin curls of transparent vapor the slight frost that had hung upon every bush and blade. The view was bounded on the west by distant mountains beyond the lakes, while the course of the Champlain could be distinctly traced as it stretched far to the north. On an eminence a few miles in front stood the town, toward which they now bent their way. The youthful stranger had in the meantime spurred on over rock and rivulet, and leaving Rutland on his left, entered by a more direct path the road leading to Castleton, so abruptly and rapidly that he had well nigh unhorsed another cavalier who was coming up the road at a round pace. Hands were on hilts in an instant, but a single glance was sufficient for mutual recognition. "Captain Phelps!" exclaimed the youth. "Mark Standish!" cried Captain Noah. "Phelps, how is it I meet you here, and whither so fast, lad?" "May I not ask the same question of you, Captain?" said Standish. "Ay, and get as satisfactory an answer. But come, I'll try points of masonry with you. Who comes from Bennington?" "Ethan and Seth," promptly answered the youth. "I would question you in turn, but I doubt you not, and there's no time to spare. The rendezvous is this night at Castleton." "Right," said the captain, "and Ethan is pushing on like mad in a forest march with his Green Mountain boys. Scouts are already thrown out beyond Castleton, and sentries posted on every pass to cut off communication between the country and the place you wot of." A pause followed, during which they looked fixedly at each other. "Whither are you going, Mark Standish?" "To Castleton." "And you, Captain Phelps?" "To Castleton also. Do you go farther to day?" "Perhaps." "And you?" "May be. A truce to trifling. I suspect we're on the same errand. But, Mark, my boy, have you reflected? It's a ticklish business. I know you're a lad of mettle, Mark. You're of a good stock, Standish. I prophesied well of you from a boy, when you mounted the colt without saddle or bridle, whip or spur, as the hounds passed you at full cry, and brought in the brush stuck in your hat, and when a few years after they carried you in triumph through the village with the wolf home before you. You're a true blue, or rather a true green, as they'll have it here on the Hampshire grants. But zounds, lad, you're too green for this affair. Leave it in my hands." "Not while I have hands of my own," said Standish. "Say you so, my lad Mark? Why then, have with you a fig for our necks. Hurrah for the Congress, and set forward." And away they went at the top of their horses' speed. A short halt at Castleton was necessary. They had ridden far and fast, and their horses and themselves must breathe and bait. Some preparation and arrangement also were requisite for the safe execution of the design they had in view. It was during their slight repast the youth related to his friend the Connecticut captain some of the incidents to which their meeting was owing. Mark Standish and Ellen Guilford were born and bred in or near the same village. Ellen was allowed by the men to be the prettiest, liveliest girl of the vicinage, and Mark, it was not denied by the women, was the handsomest and smartest young fellow. They were playmates in their childhood, and in proper seasons, which in the Green Mountains, where early marriages are encouraged, is sufficiently soon ripened into love. The passion of the boy, taking its character from his natural temperament, was deep and intense. Ellen loved, as she did everything else, with vivacity and cheerfulness. Mark could not brook a rival near her, and unfortunately for him, the charms of the village maiden drew many lovers around her. It was death to Mark to see her smile on another, and unhappily Ellen could not, in the innocence of her heart, help smiling and laughing too, upon occasion. Mark at times almost permitted himself to suspect that Ellen was something of a coquette, and Ellen, but for the purity of her thoughts, might have seen that Mark was jealous. They, however, loved each other truly and dearly, and it was a bitter moment to both when they were to part, although the separation was to be but temporary. But the aunt of Ellen Guilford had come a long journey expressly to take her home with her. She was a lone woman, having recently lost her husband, and the mother of Ellen could not refuse to a beloved sister the consolation of her niece's society for a short time. The aunt was aged, and had been left well to live as it regarded the goods of this world, and even in the pure atmosphere of the Green Mountains a little worldly prudence may be supposed to exist. Ellen raised no difficulty to going, for on the Hampshire grants, young ladies, however in love, in their most romantic moments, never dreamed of resisting the will or wishes of their parents. She went, therefore, and Mark, after accompanying her some distance toward her aunt's dwelling, which was seated on Lake Champlain, returned home to his employments, manfully resolving to bear her absence as he might. Several months had elapsed, and every young man found it less easy to repress his impatience. The few letters Ellen found opportunity to transmit were full of fond and frank affection, but Mark did not fail to hear of the manner in which she was distinguished at the rustic feats of her neighborhood, and above all that a British officer from the opposite side of the lake was her declared admirer. Whatever it was, whether love or jealousy or both, which prompted him, he came at once to the determination that he could live no longer without her. Arrangements with his father were immediately brought to a conclusion, which put him in possession of a farm of his own, and he made a last visit to the village, preparatory to setting out for the lake to claim his bride, and remove her at once from a situation which was by no means the most eligible in the present unsettled state of the country. In the village, although it was scarcely day when he entered it, all was bustle and confusion. In the streets, at the church door, on the tavern piazza, in the blacksmith's shop, groups of busy people had collected. Even the loungers at the stores no longer hung their heels idly over the counter, but all and every one seemed engaged in earnest and interesting discourse, while animated female faces looked from door and window, not through mere curiosity, but with anxiety and alarm. The meaning of all this was that intelligence of the affair of Lexington had reached them. Blood had been spilt, the blood of their fellow men, of their citizens. The charm was in a moment dissolved that had united two hemispheres in brotherhood. The blow had been struck that was to shake, convulse, and sever mighty empires. In common with their countrymen, the inhabitants of the little town of Osbrook felt in all its force the sensation such an event was calculated to inspire. Their ordinary avocations were suspended. Their quarrel with a neighboring province, upon the very eve of coming to mortal arbitrament, was cancelled and forgotten. New views of grandeur and sublimity opened upon them. Lofty and heroic thoughts took possession of their minds, and their only language was defiance to the common enemy, their only deliberation how best to serve their country. Some ardent and stirring spirits had already cast their eyes toward the British posts on Lake Champlain, commanding as they did the approach from Canada. Worcester, Dean, and Parsons, with other bold and active patriots, had even then, under the sanction of the Connecticut Assembly, obtained the necessary funds and secured the services of the renowned Ethan Allen as the leader of their enterprise of Ticonderoga and Crown Point, were actually marching by various routes and with the greatest celerity and secrecy for Castleton. The ardor of the young man was aroused by the information that one of those patriot bands had passed through the village not many hours before, but when he heard the additional report that Ellen Guilford had been clandestinely taken from her protectress by a British officer, his impatience amounted to agony. Cursing his indecision and delay, he mounted his well-tried steed, and waiting only to receive from his informant, who was knowing to the enterprise, a few lines necessary as an introduction or a pass, sped with the swiftness of wind after the advancing party. A chaos of thoughts whirled in his brain as he rode, amid which doubts of Ellen's faith for a moment intruded, but they were immediately driven forth with remorse for having cherished them. Yet he resolved to ascertain the truth, and this perhaps could be done only by entering the fortress. With this view, he proposed to the leader of the troop whom he overtook, as has been related, to bring information of the state of the garrison, and he was on his way to the lake for those purposes when he encountered Captain Phelps. "So then," said Captain Phelps, when Standish had concluded, "I find that you're bent upon risking your neck for this girl, who, don't mistake me, may be worthy of it. But after all, you have heard but a rumor." "It has been confirmed to me since I entered this place," replied Standish. "She has certainly disappeared, and in a mysterious manner." "Well, then," said the captain, as he unlocked his ample saddle-bags and took out various dresses, "let's e'en fix upon our disguises. Here's a wardrobe fit for any spy unhung in Christendom. I had some thoughts of playing the Canadian among them, as you may see by the fawn skin jacket, red worsted cap, and Sagathy breeches, but I've changed my mind, so you may have the garments if you like the character." "Not I," replied Standish. "Then we must come Yankee over them, and I've noticed enough here to baffle a nation of such underwits." Their arrangements were quickly made, and having finished their refection, they continued their course, passing without difficulty the sentinels posted on the avenues toward the lakes. Having arrived at the shore near Orwell, they left their horses in the care of a confidential person, and entering a bateau were set across this branch of Lake George. There again embarking in a skiff, which they fortunately found on the beach, they landed on the opposite shore, a little above the romantic outlet of the latter lake. They entered the works, clad in the coarse garments common to the poorer class of settlers, and their perfect acquaintance with the habits and idioms of that region enabled them easily to support the characters they assumed. The idle and arrogant soldiers of the garrison had never permitted themselves to believe that the natives or settlers around them, whom they had been accustomed to consider as an inferior race, could ever contemplate resistance, much less attack, and our adventurers were suffered to pass unquestioned as two gawky Yankee traders in small notions, a little more knave than they appeared to be, and very willing, if they could, to overreach even the sutler himself. While Captain Noah Phelps scanned everything around with a military eye, it may be naturally suspected that the anxiety of the lover mainly directed the views of Mark Standish. But his search had been as yet fruitless, and he was about to yield to utter despair when, on rounding an angle of the works, a folded paper fell at his feet. He looked and saw a white hand, for a moment, wave through the loophole high in the solid mass of masonry. Eagerly he snatched up the letter, happily unobserved, and retiring to a recess with a throbbing heart, read the following lines, traced in pencil by the hand of his Ellen. "I know you, dear Mark, but guess not your design. How I tremble for your safety! For me, fear not. I shall still preserve myself for you." The enraptured, yet indignant lover still held the letter in his hand, unconscious of danger, when suddenly a step approached, and a person crossed the opening in which he stood. Hastily he thrust the paper into his bosom, while the intruder paused, and threw a suspicious glance toward him, which he was in no condition to meet with an air of self-possession. It was a critical moment when the captain came in to the rescue. He perceived the exigency, and met it promptly. The personage before him was no less than the barber of the garrison. Phelps immediately engaged him for a cast of his office, and while the barber was reaping the full harvest of his very fertile chin, Standish had leisure to regain his composure. The captain took all with extreme coolness, not failing to drive a hard and protracted bargain with the barber for the service he had rendered, after which he led the way in a shambling, careless gait out of the garrison. "I told you so," said the captain, when they had got into the country. "You had like to have ruined all." "She is here," cried Standish, "and can ought I?" "Yes," replied Phelps, interrupting him. "You both can and ought to come along as fast as your legs will carry you, unless you would stay and be hanged." There was no rebutting an argument like this, and without unnecessary delay our adventurers retraced their way to Orwell. Captain Phelps now proceeded straight to Castleton, while Standish sought the late residence of his Ellen. He found the aged relative almost distracted with her loss, but unable to say how or by whose agency it was effected. She had indeed reason to suspect the young British officer, who from the time he met Ellen at the village ball had paid her uncommon attention. More than once the old lady had heard at night the sound of a flute from the lake under her window, and shrewdly suspected it to be a serenade to Ellen, but she was sure the dear girl had never given the man the least encouragement, and as to going off with him willingly, the thing was not to be thought of. Standish communicated to the good dame as much of the actual position of affairs as he deemed proper, and was rewarded by hearing related 1,000 proofs of her niece's virtues, and twice that number of her affection for her dear Mark. Night had fallen, and the troops assembled at Castleton were enjoying a short repose after the day's fatigue, when a stranger, who had been stopped as he attempted to pass the guard, was at his peremptory demand conducted by a sentinel to headquarters. Ethan Allen was seated at the head of a table, around which sat several other officers, when the stranger, a young man of a proud and martial deportment, his blue military cloak thrown gracefully over his shoulder, entered the room. "Swagger and martinet," muttered Allen, as the stranger appeared. Then addressing the subject of his remark, "Well, sir, you see Ethan Allen. Quick, who, what?" "I'm not used to be interrogated in that style or tone," answered the stranger, drawing himself up haughtily. "Ho!" roared Ethan Allen, distending the circle of his large eyes to a most ludicrous circumference. "Well, sir, to amplify according to the book, who are you, and what do you want?" "My name is Arnold." "Not unlikely. And in the name of the Witch of Endor, who is Arnold?" "I am known to some of your officers," said Arnold. "I know the gentleman," observed Blagden. "'Tis Captain Arnold of the Connecticut Volunteers." "It may be so," said Ellen. "Will Captain Arnold of the Connecticut Volunteers signify his pleasure?" "By this commission you will be taught that I am now Colonel Arnold, sir, and by this," producing another paper, "that I am authorized and ordered by the Committee of Safety of Massachusetts to raise a force of 400 men and attack Ticonderoga." The astonishment of Allen was fearful. "Massachusetts, Colonel," he repeated, "by the horn of Jericho, you raise men! Soul of Samuel, where are they? Hey!" "You have, I thank you, raised them to my hands," replied Arnold, with his customary confidence. The ample chest of Allen heaved with an earthquake of passion. "To your hands!" he cried. "Yours! By the crack of God's field piece! Your impudence is amusing. And who then," he added, cocking fiercely his little three-cornered hat, "who then am I?" "Captain Allen," answered the stranger, with a condescending air, "of whose services Colonel Arnold would be proud to avail himself." "Good! Better and better! Excellent!" said Allen, in a smothered tone. "By the Lord of Hosts, there is metal in this martinet. Hand me your papers, young man, and be seated." Arnold took a chair, while Allen hastily glanced over the papers, and then, with a smile of peculiar meaning, said, "You are appointed colonel by a committee whose power I shall not question. Now here's a council of war, are you not, gentlemen? Whose power you must not question, sir. You appoint me, do you not, gentlemen, a colonel also?" "Certainly, 'tis your right," they all cried. "Well, then, our grade is the same it seems now to rank. Happening to have the power, I settle it in my own favor, which if any one dispute, I'll send his soul to hell fire in the priming of a rifle, and this same," putting forth his gigantic arm, "shall be the beetle of mortality. Ay, ay," he added, in spite of 20 such muscle whangers as that young man. "Pshaw, lad alive, leave fingering the pommel of your sword. The thing is settled by authority, and as a philosopher and soldier, not doubting that you are each, you must submit. There's stuff in you fit for use, though not over malleable, and by Judas and the rest, no illusion, sir, you shall have a place and employment. Come, gentlemen, 'tis time to set forward. Is there any report from the party detached to the head of the lake?" "This moment a messenger has arrived. Skenesborough is taken, and Skene himself secured," replied an officer at the door. "Hurrah!" shouted Allen. The would-be royal governor of Ticonderoga is ours. No more delay. To horse in the name of God, and away." "But, sir," said Arnold. "Buts won't do, sir. I've said it. Old Ethan, whom they call the outlaw, who laughs at the lightning, outscolds thunder, and defies the devil and Governor Tryon. Old Ellen, who studied divinity in his youth, and became a soldier by passion, knows but little of the world of spirits, but he will be treated in the other world as a gentleman of his merit ought to be. Come, hurrah for the Green Mountains, and forward to old Ty." Hereupon the council broke up, Arnold yielding with a tolerable grace to an arrangement he could not better, and in a short time the whole body of troops was in brisk motion. It was almost day when the American force arrived, silent and unseen, on the bank of the lake, opposite Ticonderoga. Their horses were secured in the neighborhood, and while some of the men were collecting the few boats scattered along the shore, the rest were dispersed in picturesque groups upon the bank. It was a scene of awful stillness. The lake reposed dark and unruffled by a single breeze. The moon was absent from the heavens, and the eye could with difficulty trace on the western horizon the dimly defined outline of the most prominent and elevated part of the fortress, now an object of such intense interest. "Ay," said Ethan Allen, in a suppressed tone, "there she is, the brimstone of Babylon. There's old Ty, with whom I long to have a grapple, as a lover with his mistress. How soundly the Jezebel sleeps on the brink of perdition, little dreaming who are about to beat up her head quarters. But it's the same to her, French, English, or Yankees. To do the old girl justice, however, she held Abercrombie at arm's length as Putnam. The wolf hunter has told me who was in the frolic when that hare-brained boy, Lord Howe, the king's bastard, with many other brave fellows, legitimate and otherwise, left his body in the outworks. But then again, Amherst had her for the asking without penny or price. Well, boys, we may have a tussle for it, but I conclude we're ready. So embark in the name of the pillars of fire and of smoke. Act like men, men of the Hampshire grants, and never bring a blush on the Green Mountains. An advance guard of 83 men, as many as the boats could contain, now proceeded to embark. Halt there, friend, whispered Allen to Arnold, as the latter was attempting to pass him. Not before the Commodore, Colonel, and enforced his suggestion with no very gentle constriction of the arm, in fact with the grasp of a tourniquet or a vice. No man of God's moulding before Ethan, and he stepped on board, followed by Arnold, Standish, and others of the most eager. Motionless as statues and almost as breathless, they glided over the still lake, the dull sound of the muffled oar scarcely reaching the stem or stern of the boat, and not a ripple following its silent dip or its leathery skin over the undisturbed surface of the water. It was when the east first became dappled by the dawn that the party landed on the hostile shore near their slumbering foes. The boats were immediately sent back for the rear guard under Seth Warner, while the advance was drawn up in triple rank, and Ethan Allen, whose huge dimensions the occasion seemed to swell to gigantic size, harangued the brave band. "Fellow soldiers," said he, "you have long been the terror of arbitrary power in the person of the petty despot Tryon. Your fame has gone abroad, as appears from the honor conferred on you and me by the General Assembly of Connecticut. You are now in a few minutes to prove yourselves worthy of your reputation for valor, or abandon your pretensions forever. I'm ordered to take possession of the fortress before you, and propose to lead you at once through the gate. It is a desperate attempt, and none but the bravest of men will undertake it. On those who are not brave I do not urge it. You who volunteer to follow me, poise your firelocks." There was not one of the band who did not throw his piece to the poise. "To the right face," said Allen, and placing himself in the front of the centre file, marched his column in double quick time directly to the southern entrance. On approaching the gate, Arnold endeavored to place himself at the head of the column. "By heavens, sir," cried he, "I will enter first. My rank entitles me to it." "By hell, sir," answered Allen, "if you attempt it, I'll send you to salvation or otherwise before your watch ticks thrice. For God's sake, Allen, Arnold, at such a time, in such a situation to dispute. Shame, shame," whispered several voices near them. "Well, sir, this much I'll grant. We'll go in together. But stop there on my left, if you please," said Allen, and in this manner they entered the gateway. A sentinel posted at the wicket, completely surprised, presented his piece at Allen's breast. "A snap, by Jupiter Protector! Follow my boys," cried Allen, as he pursued the retreating sentinel by the covered way into the body of the place. Uttering a cry of alarm, the sentinel fled into a casemate. Standish had entered almost at the side of Allen, and a second sentinel charged upon him and wounded him slightly with his bayonet. Allen turned to his rescue. His tremendous arm was raised for the fatal blow, when suddenly he changed his purpose, and let his sword fall gently down the side of the sentinel's head, merely scraping of one ear and the better part of the cheek in the descent. The poor fellow dropped his arms and begged for quarter, while the troops formed in two lines, each facing a line of barracks, and were waking the garrison with three terrific hurrahs. Allen had questioned the prostrate sentinel, and following his directions, immediately ran up a stone stairway on the western side of the esplanade to the chamber of the commandant. "Come forth," he cried in a voice like the roaring of the Niagara, "you who command these slaves, you de la Place, come out, lobster, back from your shell, or every soul of you, fish or flesh, shall be sacrificed." The unfortunate commander appeared at his chamber door in extreme undress, and the picture of dismay and despair. "Do you deliver me the fortress?" cried Allen. "In whose name do you demand it?" asked the petrified de la Place, not certain whether he was capitulating to men or devils. "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress," thundered Allen. "Nay, no parleying," he added, observing the commandant about to speak. "Surrender or death." The ill-fated de la Place, with the sword literally suspended over his head, gave order for his men to parade without arms, as he had surrendered the fort. It was in the grey of the morning of the 10th of May, 1775, that this most important fortress, with all its formidable and extensive equipment and warlike store, was yielded to the gallantry of a few boys of the Green Mountains. The sun rose in unusual splendor, as if smiling on the achievement. On the same day, Crown Point surrendered to the brave and indefatigable Seth Warner, who had been detached with a part of the reserve, and immediately after Arnold surprised and captured a vessel of war at the lower extremity of Champlain, and thus the entire command of the lakes rested with the Americans. To return to Ticonderoga, the victors were assembled at the board making ample amends for all their late privations, when Allan remarked the absence of the young volunteer who had been wounded at his side, and inquired with much interest as to his fate. But no one could say what had become of him. The last time he was seen was when the assaulting party was beating in the barrack doors, in which, it was observed, he assisted with the fury of a lion. There was also a subaltern of the garrison missing, whose absence could not be accounted for, any more than that of Standish. A short time, however, explained the mystery. Mark Standish had indeed pursued his search with fury, and even frenzy. Every room was entered, but Ellen was nowhere to be found. Yet the chamber from which the letter had the day before been dropped seemed to have been recently abandoned. He repeated his inquiries on every side, and was at length told by a soldier of the garrison that on the first alarm he had seen a female borne by an officer through one of the narrow passages between the blocks of the barracks. Standish instantly started off in the direction indicated, and gained the open country, struck into the only path which seemed to be practicable. Along this he ran, he flew, at intervals pausing to call aloud the name of his beloved. The way became more rugged and difficult as it led among the hills, and he was about sinking to despair when he thought he heard a response to his call in a faint female voice. Again he shouted. He paused in breathless suspense, but no answer was returned. Was it then but an echo that mocked him? One effort more, and summoning his powers of voice, as he leaned in his exhaustion against a tree, he called on Ellen. A voice not distant but indistinct, as if stifled in its utterance, pronounced his name. He was no longer weak. With the vigor of the deer he bounded forward, and in an instant beheld the form of a man, near whom lay, exhausted and fainting, his beloved Ellen. Like the panther springing toward his prey, he was met by one whose nerves were strung by desperation. The conflict was terrible. At length the energies of the mountain boy triumphed, and his sinewy foe rolled over the edge of the deep and cragged ravine near which they had met. His tremendous efforts over, Standish sank down almost insensible. But it was on the bosom of Ellen that his head rested. It was the voice of Ellen that recalled him to life and revived him to love. Resting within her arms, he listened to the narrative which dispelled every suspicion. The British officer had, by 1,000 assiduities, endeavored to make an impression upon Ellen's heart. Her reserve did but increase his passion, and when finally the formal tender of his hand was rejected, and he learned that the heart he sought was devoted to another, maddened with love and jealousy, he formed the plan of carrying her off and conveying her to Quebec, to which station he exerted influence enough to obtain his recall. A soldier of the garrison was bribed to accompany him night after night to the opposite shore, until the opportunity at last occurred for which he had so long waited. She was found alone upon the bank, was seized and borne to the fort, where with the aid of gold the officer had succeeded in concealing her even from the knowledge of the commandant. Standish heard with sensible satisfaction that the forcible seizure and detention only excepted, there was nothing in the conduct of the officer not marked by the most scrupulous delicacy and regard to honor, and that he depended only upon the total estrangement from her friends and of a course of the most tender attention for the success of his suit. Standish conducted his recovered bride back to the circle of his military friends, while under the banner of his country, already streaming from the rampart, they were rejoicing in their victory. He, without delay, sent out a party to bring in the body of the wounded officer, whose wounds he found, to his infinite relief, though serious, were not mortal, and soon after crossed the lake and lent his Ellen to the embrace of her good aunt. Mark Standish and Ellen Guilford were married and settled on their own farm, occasionally aiding his countrymen in arms in their struggle for independence, and now returning, like Cincinnatus, to his plough, he passed through the scenes of the Revolutionary War with a high reputation. He lived to see his country become a free and powerful nation, and the Hampshire grants, under the appropriate appellation of Vermont, a thriving state of the American Union; to see new towns and cities spring up around him, and the lakes and their shores, after being, in a subsequent war, the theaters of the triumphs of American fleets and armies, become, when peace returned, the object of research and enjoyment to the refined and elegant of the nation. Ellen gave to his board several blooming and beautiful girls, all of whom obtained respectable husbands, and about an equal number of sensible, spirited boys, some of whom were, in process of time, sent to the Assembly, and one of whom, it is said, was returned to Congress. It is certain that our lovers live long and happily together, and for all I've heard to the contrary, our Mark Standish, the Green Mountain Boy, is the identical old revolutionary character who at the flourishing town of Osbrook read the glorious Declaration of Independence on the recent celebration of its 50th anniversary. End of section 1. Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, The Rattlesnake Hunter by J. G. Whittier. Until my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. During a delightful excursion in the vicinity of the Green Mountains a few years since, I had the good fortune to meet with a singular character known in many parts of Vermont as the rattlesnake hunter. It was a warm, clear day of sunshine in the middle of June that I saw him for the first time while engaged in a mineralogical ramble among the hills. His head was bald, and his forehead was deeply marked with the strong lines of care and age. His form was wasted and meagre, and but for the fiery vigor of his eye, he might have been supposed incapacitated by age and infirmities for even a slight exertion. Yet he hurried over the huge ledges of rock with a quick and almost youthful tread, and seemed earnestly searching among the crevices and loose crags and stinted bushes around him. All at once he started suddenly, drew himself back with a sort of shuddering recoil, and then smote fiercely with his staff upon the rock before him. Another and another blow, and he lifted the lithe and crushed form of a large rattlesnake upon the end of his rod. The old man's eye glistened, but his lip trembled as he looked steadfastly upon his yet writhing victim. Another of the accursed race, he muttered between his clenched teeth, apparently unconscious of my presence. I was now satisfied that the person before me was none other than the famous rattlesnake hunter. He was known throughout the neighborhood as an outcast and a wanderer, obtaining a miserable subsistence from the casual charities of the people around him. His time was mostly spent among the rocks and rude hills, where his only object seemed to be the hunting out and destroying of the Crotalus horridus, or rattlesnake. I immediately determined to satisfy my curiosity, which had been strangely excited by the remarkable appearance of the stranger, and for this purpose I approached him. "Are there many of these reptiles in this vicinity?" I inquired, pointing to the crushed serpent. "They are getting to be scarce," said the old man, lifting his slouched hat and wiping his bald brow. "I've known the time when you could hardly stir 10 rods from your door in this part of the state without hearing their low, quick rattle at your side, or seeing their many-colored bodies coiling up in your path. But as I said before, they are getting to be scarce. The infernal race will be extinct in a few years, and thank God I have myself been a considerable cause of their extermination." "You must, of course, know the nature of these creatures perfectly well," said I. "Do you believe in their power of fascination or charming?" The old man's countenance fell. There was a visible struggle of feeling within him, for his lip quivered, and he dashed his brown hand suddenly across his eyes, as if to conceal a tear, but quickly recovering himself, he answered in the low, deep voice of one that was about to reveal some horrible secret. "I believe in the rattlesnake's power of fascination as firmly as I believe in my own existence." "Surely," said I, "you do not believe that they have power over human beings?" "I do. I know it to be so," and the old man trembled as he spoke. "You are a stranger to me," he said slowly, after scrutinizing my features for a moment, but if you will go down with me to the foot of this rock, in the shade there," and he pointed to a group of leaning oaks that hung over the declivity, "I will tell you a strange and sad story of my own experience." It may be supposed that I readily assented to this proposal, bestowing one more blow upon the rattlesnake, as if to be certain of his death. The old man descended the rocks with a rapidity that would have endangered the neck of a less practised hunter. After reaching the place which he pointed out, the rattlesnake hunter commenced his story in a manner which confirmed what I had previously heard of his education and intellectual strength. I was among the earliest settlers in this part of the country. I had just finished my education at Harvard, when I was induced by the flattering representations of some of the earliest pioneers into the wild lands beyond the Connecticut to seek my fortune in the new settlements. My wife, the old man's eye glistened an instant, and then a tear crossed his brown cheek. My wife accompanied me, young and delicate and beautiful as she was, to this wild and rude country. I shall never forgive myself for bringing her hither, never. Young man, continued he, you look like one who could pity. You shall see the image of the girl who followed me to the new country, and he unbound as he spoke a ribbon from his neck, with a small miniature attached to it. It was that of a beautiful female, but there was an almost childish expression in her countenance, a softness, a delicacy, and a sweetness of smile, which I have seldom seen in the features of those who have tasted, even slightly, the bitter waters of existence. The old man watched my countenance intently, as I surveyed the image of his early love. She must have been very beautiful, I said, as I returned the picture. Beautiful, he repeated. You may well say so, but this avails nothing. I have a fearful story to tell. Would to God I had not attempted it, but I will go on. My heart has been stretched too often on the rack of memory to suffer any new pang. We had resided in the new country nearly a year. Our settlements had increased rapidly, and the comforts and delicacies of life were beginning to be felt, after the weary privations and severe trials to which we had been subjected. The red men were few and feeble, and did not molest us. The beasts of the forest and mountain were ferocious, but we suffered little from them. The only immediate danger to which we were exposed resulted from the rattlesnakes, which infested our neighborhood. 3 or 4 of our settlers were bitten by them, and died in terrible agonies. The Indians often told us frightful stories of this snake and its powers of fascination, and although they were generally believed, yet for myself I confess I was rather amused than convinced by their marvelous legends. In one of my hunting excursions abroad, on a fine morning, it was just at this time of the year, I was accompanied by my wife. 'Twas a beautiful morning. The sunshine was warm, but the atmosphere was perfectly clear, and a fine breeze from the northwest shook the bright green leaves, which clothed to profusion the wreathing branches above us. I had left my companion for a short time in the pursuit of game, and in climbing a rugged ledge of rocks, interspersed with shrubs and dwarfish trees, I was startled by a quick grating rattle. I looked forward. On the edge of a loosened rock lay a large rattlesnake, coiling himself as if for the deadly spring. He was within a few feet of me, and I paused for an instant to survey him. I know not why, but I stood still and looked at the deadly serpent with a strange feeling of curiosity. Suddenly he unwound his coil, as if relenting from his purpose of hostility, and raising his head he fixed his bright, fiery eye directly upon my own. A chilling and indescribable sensation, totally different from anything I had ever before experienced, followed this movement of the serpent, but I stood still and gazed steadily and earnestly, for at that moment there was a visible change in the reptile. His form seemed to grow larger, and his colours brighter. His body moved with a slow, almost imperceptible motion toward me, and a low hum of music came from him, or at least it sounded in my ear, a strange, sweet melody, faint as that which melts from the throat of the humming-bird. Then the tints of his body deepened and changed and glowed like the changes of a beautiful kaleidoscope, green, purple, and gold, until I lost sight of the serpent entirely, and saw only wild and curiously woven circles of strange colours quivering around me like an atmosphere of rainbows. I seemed in the centre of a great prism, a world of mysterious colours and tints, varied and darkened, and lighted up again around me, and the low music went on without ceasing until my brain reeled, and fear for the first time came like a shadow over me. The new sensation gained upon me rapidly, and I could feel the cold sweat gushing from my brow. I had no certainty of danger in my mind, no definite ideas of peril. All was vague and clouded like the unaccountable terrors of a dream, and yet my limbs shook, and I fancied I could feel the blood stiffening with cold as it passed along my veins. I would have given worlds to have been able to tear myself from the spot. I even attempted to do so, but the body obeyed not the impulse of the mind. Not a muscle stirred, and I stood still as if my feet had grown to the solid rock, with the infernal music of the tempter in my ear, and the baleful colourings of his enchantment before me. Suddenly a new sound came on my ear. It was a human voice, but it seemed strange and awful. Again, but I stirred not, and then a white form plunged before me and grasped my arm. The horrible spell was at once broken. The strange colours passed from before my vision. The rattlesnake was coiling at my very feet, with glowing eyes and uplifted fangs, and my wife was clinging in terror upon me. The next instant the serpent threw himself upon us. My wife was the victim. The fatal fangs pierced deeply into her hand, and her scream of agony as she staggered backward from me told me the dreadful truth. Then it was that a feeling of madness came upon me, and when I saw the foul serpent stealing away from his work, reckless of danger, I sprang forward and crushed him under my feet, grinding him upon the ragged rock. The groans of my wife now recalled me to her side, and to the horrible reality of her situation. There was a dark, livid spot on her hand, and it deepened into blackness as I led her away. We were at a considerable distance from any dwelling, and after wandering for a short time, the pain of her wound became insupportable to my wife, and she swooned away in my arms. Weak and exhausted as I was, I yet had strength enough remaining to carry her to the nearest rivulet and bathe her brow in the cool water. She partially recovered, and sat down upon the bank, while I supported her head upon my bosom. Hour after hour passed away, and none came near us, and there, alone in the great wilderness, I watched over her and prayed with her, and she died. The old man groaned audibly as he uttered these words, and as he clasped his long bony hands over his eyes, I could see the tears falling thickly through his gaunt fingers. After a momentary struggle with his feelings, he lifted his head once more, and there was a fierce light in his eyes as he spoke. "But I have had my revenge. From that fatal moment I have felt myself fitted and set apart by the terrible ordeal of affliction to rid the place of my abode of its foulest curse. And I have well nigh succeeded. The fascinating demons are already few and powerless. Do not imagine," said he, earnestly regarding the somewhat equivocal expression of my countenance, "that I consider these creatures as serpents only, creeping serpents. They are serpents of the fallen angel, the immediate ministers of the infernal gulf. Years have passed since my interview with the rattlesnake hunter. The place of his abode has changed. A beautiful village rises near the spot of our conference, and the grass of the churchyard is green over the grave of the old hunter. But his story is fixed upon my mind, and time, like enamel, only burns deeper the first impression. It comes up before me like a vividly remembered dream, whose features are too horrible for reality. End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. Beginning the World. It would be difficult to imagine a more unhappy animal than he who is encumbered with an imposing establishment while his supplies are uncertain and scanty. The truth of this I had occasion to experience some years ago when I first began the world. The little fortune which my father left me was all expended in obtaining a procuratorship and in furnishing, after the best models, a flat in Queen Street, where I placed 2 red-haired clerks upon a pair of 3-legged stools of unusual elevation, and seated myself in a leather-encircled armchair with the absurd expectation of being called upon by clients. Clients! Not the shadow of one darkened my beautiful whitewashed walls. The glaring brass plate on the door, something about the size of a shovel, with its hospitable "Come in," was misanthropically disregarded. It seemed as if litigation had ceased with the opening of my rooms, and I began to think seriously of Edward Irving's millennium. To me a client was as the mammoth among quadrupeds, or dodo among birds, extinct. I had not even the satisfaction of possessing a petrified one, nor could I trace the remains of any among all my curiosities. To increase my embarrassments, I was on the eve of getting married. It is charitably said of the devil that he finds work for the idle. So I, being utterly unemployed, was tempted to fall in love with a young lady belonging to Berwick. My last 10 guineas were expended in paying her a visit and in receiving her formidable "yes." "Next month is May, Arabella," I said. Her name was Arabella Farquhar, and it seemed formed, with its number of R's, to stifle the Berwickers. "It is unlucky, you know, to marry in May, but I cannot wait a day longer than the 1st of June." "The glorious 1st of June," said she, smiling, for, in addition to her other attractions, she had a playful humour. "Would you not, as a West Country Radical, prefer the ever-memorial days of July?" "Nay, in love I have no politics." "That is, you are impolitic in love." "I am desperately in love, which is all I know," returned I, enforcing my affirmation with a kiss. The respect which I paid to the old superstition regarding May marriages was occasioned by the circumstances that I had no hopes of raising money for my purposes before the 1st of June. These hopes, as the reader will see, were built on a very questionable foundation. The only relation left me in the world was my maiden aunt, Mrs. Thompson, of Cockleshell Hall, near Musselburgh. I call her maiden, for I cannot consider her in any other light, although it is undeniable that she had once been married. She was a woman of untold wealth and inconceivable parsimony. When young, her fortune was but forming, and her face was then even less attractive, if I may judge from a portrait taken at 20, than when time had disguised it. So she was left to live to the alarming age of 45 without an offer. At that period, however, her fortune, by dint of parsimony, having increased to a reverential amount, a certain Mr. Thompson, compassionating her state of single blessedness, threw himself at her feet, and was, to the infinite consternation of all her living relations, accepted. The marriage of any young lady of 45 furnishes food for scandal, but in this match there was nothing prominently absurd, indiscreet, or inappropriate. Mr. Thompson was an ancient widower, of respectable character and well-to-do in the world. He had been provost from time immemorial of the little borough in which he resided, and was therefore happily distinguished from the innumerable tribe of Thompsons by his title of honour. Like Macbeth, he had no children, and considered himself to stand in need of a wife, to warm his slippers when fallen into the sere and yellow leaf. But death interfered with his self-indulgent perspectives. Scarcely was the honeymoon over, with all its indescribable annoyances, when one morning after breakfast, as Provost Thompson was standing with his back to the fire, he stopped abruptly in the midst of a laugh at one of the quaint jokes for which he was famous, and, sitting down in his chair, gave a groan and expired. Apoplexy was the cause assigned for this appalling event. My poor aunt was exemplary as a widow, with her tears and her crape, even for a longer period than the rules of society demand, and her sympathizing relations were, for several months, eager in watching any demonstrations of connubial affection that might become visible under her weeds of woe. Their anxiety was absurd, for no one with a notion of affinities could outrage his imagination so far as to consider her for a moment in the light of a mother. She belonged naturally, constitutionally, and entirely to that highly respectable class of capitalists, old maids. It was but a presumptuous blunder of the Provost to endeavour to remove her from the sphere where Providence had placed her, and though he had been Bluebeard himself and lived half a century, he could never have moulded her to the accommodating shape, bearing, and appearance of a wife. As it was, the little month of connubial bliss made no impression on her. It merely changed her name, not her nature, and in doing so, I believe, it accomplished all that she wished, for to be called Mrs. Provost Thompson instead of Miss Brown was the temptation that induced her to commit matrimony. Uninstructed by the frightful termination of her connection, the infatuated creature continued to hug her treasures, and even to add to their accumulation with tenfold voracity. The property which the will of the Provost left her only whetted her appetite for more, and by the time she had reached her 60th and I my 25th year, her fortune was calculated to exceed half a plum, or, in more figurative language, £50,000. If there were any one toward whom she entertained a kindness, it was my own ungrateful self. I was, in fact, her factotum, for from my 15th year, being no penman herself, she entrusted me with drawing out all her receipts for rental. For this purpose I regularly spent a day or two with her every Whitsunday and Martinmas, and in return for my attentions I regularly received from her, mirabile dictu, a £5 note. This was the only pecuniary enormity of which she was guilty during the year, and, to do her justice, she gave it, I believe, out of an habitual regard for me, while she would inwardly soothe her outraged parsimony by the reflection that no man of business would do what I did half so cheap. On the faith of her gift, many a sanguine young man would have anticipated the heirship of all her property, but I confess I never was so preposterous in my expectations, for I felt too distinctly that I was born with a wooden spoon in my mouth. Independently of this, I knew she read the missionary magazine, and spoke occasionally with an alarming interest of the New Zealanders, so that, if she ever had the fortitude to make a will, the cannibals of the South Sea Islands would in all probability be the favoured few. Her health, besides, was good, her hold on the world tenacious, so that even if I did entertain any hopes of succession, the day was too distant to interest me much. At all events, no future prospect could relieve my present difficulties, or put it in my power to consummate my own and Arabella's bliss. A bold stroke was necessary, a bold stroke for a wife, and the necessity suggested one. Insane as it may appear, I absolutely resolved to ask from my aunt, when I went in May to draw out her Whitsunday receipts, the loan, believe me, of £1,000, and upon the success of that request I relied when I proposed the 1st of June to my dear Arabella as our day of marriage. This resolution of attacking my aunt I did not come to without severe reflections. I procured a copy of the eccentric biography, and carefully studied the lives of all the misers therein contained, so that I might inform myself as to their weak or assailable points. But I found them all cased in triple steel, no crevice in their iron mail through which a spear could be insinuated, no opening through which their hearts could be touched. They were not even, like the alligator, vulnerable in the belly. Neither puddings nor praise affected them. The only way in which they could be attacked with any prospect of success was by a coup de main. Old Elwes, I discovered, though he would not part with a penny to save his most miserable soul, sometimes gave thousands in loan on trifling securities. Upon that hint I spake. I saw the absurdity of attacking the penny-wise feelings of my aunt, and resolved to rest my chance of success on her pounds foolish. A small sum would, I felt, rouse all her customary power of resistance, but the demand of £1,000 sterling was too appalling to be resisted by mortal miser. The enormity would paralyze her energies and leave her helpless in my hands. It would be an appeal for which her imagination had never, in its most daring flights, prepared, and she would sink submissive under it, overwhelmed by its boldness and grandeur. Not, I confess, that I anticipated an entire acquiescence in the extent of my demand, but to ask 1,000, I calculate, would secure at least 500. By aiming at the stars, I would reach the clouds. If she succeeded in reducing my request to 500, or still better, to 499, she would lose sight of everything else in self-congratulation at her adroitness in mitigating the calamity. It was no part of my plan to "go about the bush" in the matter. That would have alarmed her, and put her on her guard. My object was to attack her openly and unexpectedly, for any other method would have argued a misgiving on my part, and infused her with courage to resist. Accordingly, I had no sooner reached Cockleshell Hall and gone through the usual congratulation than I prepared to open my attack. My aunt speedily gave me no opportunity. "My dear nephew," she said with her usual emphatic monosyllables, "it is so fortunate that Whitsunday happens at this time, and that you have come a day sooner than usual, for do you know that I have got 2 ladies staying with me who are dying for a gallant?" "Indeed! Then I am fortunate in more ways than one, for I was just remarking to myself as I came up the avenue, which by the by I see you have greatly improved, that it was as well that I required to visit you at this time, as it saved me the trouble of writing to you by post for the loan of £1,000, of which I happen to stand at present in need." I said this in as indifferent a matter-of-course manner as I could assume, although I believe my voice did falter a little, for I thought of poor Arabella. But the manner of speaking is not so important as the matter, notwithstanding all that elocutionists may say. £1,000 is no trifle, pronounce it as you will. It made my aunt gasp, as if I had pitched a tub of water in her face, or as if I had placed her in an elevated shower bath with 1,000 holes in its drainer. £1,000! You are surely demented, John. Indeed, aunt, if it would not be rather encroaching on your goodness, 2,000 would be more convenient for me than one. But a young man is the better of being stinted a little when beginning the world. 2,000! Beginning the world, John! Have you not begun yet? Now, aunt, that is too bad. You cannot but know what it is to begin the world. Would you have me believe that you never were so foolish yourself as to marry? Marry? Are you going to marry? I am going to follow your good example, aunt, in that particular. Me? You should rather take warning from my misfortune. Nay, it is unfeeling in you, John, to allude to the matter. I know it was the subject upon which she loved especially to dilate. When you knew the manner in which my poor dear husband was taken from me. Think, John, of only 28 days married. Here she took out her handkerchief. We had just got all the garavaging and expense of the draft days over, and I was remarking that the veal pie might have been better haned and served langer, as a decency for our breakfast table, when the poor dear Provost, who was standing joking with his back to the chimney and the tails of his coat in his arms, gied a sudden jerk into the elbow chair, and, before I could turn round, was a corpse. Never married woman was tried like me. Here she fell into appropriate sobs, which I did not dislike, for women are said to be most accessible when they have the tears in their eye. "Do not distress yourself, my dear aunt," I said, "about this sad affair. You proved during your short wedlock, I have reason to know, all that a husband could wish, and let it be a balsam to your grief that it is not embittered by self-reproach. As to my own marriage, I have only to pray—" John, you speak as if you had completed all your arrangements, and had only to send for the minister. What madness is this, and who is your wife to be? The unfortunate lady whom I have selected as my victim, and who is so far lost to herself as to approve of my choice, is irreproachable in character and descent, unequalled in beauty, and almost as poor as myself. Well, if you and she choose to make beggars of yourselves, I leave you to your own delusions. It is no concern of mine." "How, my dear aunt? Do you mean to say that you will so far disoblige me as refuse to grant my small request?" "Small request! The boy's in a creed. You imagine surely that I am wallowing in wealth. Far from it. I know in these hard times you have come to many losses, and must have enough ado to make the ends meet. Still, I am presumptive enough to hope that you will make a struggle to oblige an old friend, the son of your only brother William, who was your own little Billy when a child, and whom the hungry sea devoured in his prime of manhood." Here were two hits, one on the side of her parsimony, and the other on the side of her affections. Like all wealthy misers, she was very anxious to be considered poor, and rejoiced to be condoled with on her losses. She, beside, entertained a deep regard for the memory of my father, who was shipwrecked on his way from Quebec, whither he had gone to purchase timber. He was her only brother, and being 6 years younger than herself, had secured the affection of her girlhood, before her heart got hardened and polluted by care and avarice. Deeply as she seemed to mourn the loss of her poor dear Provost, that was but the mockery of woe compared to the untold tenderness with which she ever reverted to my poor father's fate. The name of the one was a mere signal for her to display the widow's flag of distress. The name of the other was connected with all her sweetest and holiest emotions, for it renewed in the silver light of memory the young days of her life, when she used to toss her little brother in her arms or roll with him in boisterous glee among the grassy knolls. "John," she said, after a pause, "you must be conscious that I have ever taken a deep interest in your welfare, for your own sake, and still more for the sake of him, my poor brother, who sleeps at the bottom of the Atlantic Sea. But I am shocked, John, really shocked, at the extravagance of your demand, and wonder any young man of discretion like you should be so absurd as to think of marriage before you have established yourself in the world. See how I did in the matter. I waited till—" "Oh, aunt," interrupted I, delighted at the turn matters were taking. For if the woman who deliberates is lost, so also is the woman who begins to argufy. "Oh, aunt, do not, I beseech you, balance my conduct with your own, for though it were 1,000 times more blameless, it would never come up to your standard. I am but a poor, ever blundering, ever resolving fool that can lay claim to no quality beyond good intention. You, on the other hand, have led a life of unswerving virtue, and are guiltless even of the slightest impropriety. If that be your opinion, it became you certainly to seek my counsel before you involved yourself in so important a matter as matrimony. And indeed, John, to tell you the truth, circumstances have led me within these 2 days to think of the very subject, for there are at present, as I informed you, 2 ladies staying with me, one of whom has so interested me by her excellent qualities that it has more than once crossed my mind that she would make a fortunate match for you, if your circumstances permitted. Alas, aunt, all people see not with the same eyes, and I, at all events, am irrevocably engaged. In drink, then, as ye brood. Since you can do without my advice, you can do without my money. Are you not getting rather unreasonable, Mrs. Thompson? Are you not getting excessively impertinent, Master John Brown? Nay, let us not quarrel about a trifle. You surely would allow me some degree of suffrage in a matter so personally interesting as the choice of a wife? I wish to meddle with no man's affairs, but for the sake of him, poor William, your father, I cannot but take an interest in your welfare, and if you had made a reasonable match with a young lady of whom I could approve, I will not promise, but I might have helped you a little until your business were established, with the understanding that I would receive a legal percentage for what I might advance. Then, my dear aunt, I feel assured you have but to see my choice to be pleased with her. Such beauty, wit, virtue! Pooh! I doubt she is some low person, or you would not insist on these things. Is she of a good family? Has she any money, or the prospect of any? That is what I wish to know. Her family is irreproachable, for her father can trace his genealogy as far back as the days of George III, and none of them ever suffered under the hands of the hangman. As to her wealth, she is possessed, I am happy to say, of a great many properties. She has a well-furnished memory, an excellently cultivated understanding, a superb imagination, a brilliant wit, and an unbounded store of affection, not to mention the lustre of her personal affections, her pearly teeth and diamond eyes. It is too much your habit, John, to speak slightingly of serious matters. These qualities I hold not the value of a pin's point, unless they are accompanied by the 3 indispensable P's to the character of a good wife: prudence, piety, and property. And is your favourite upstairs possessed of these qualifications? Tell me, aunt, who is she? The lady upstairs is a comparative stranger to me, but I am mightily pleased by what I have seen of her. Your old acquaintance, Mrs. Smith of Berwick, brought her. She is a Miss Farquhar, and belongs herself, I believe, to that quarter, although Mrs. Smith tells me she has some prospects of finally settling in your own town of Glasgow. A glass of water, if you please. Tush, I am quite well, aunt, a mere momentary qualm. And now I have to reproach you, as well as myself, for leaving the ladies so long to themselves by our idle chat, on a subject which can be talked over again. We must, for very decency, go upstairs. Please introduce me. It is cruel to delay another moment. As my aunt ushered me into the room with a formal explanation of Mr. Brown, my nephew, from Glasgow, Arabella, who was sitting at a work-table with Mrs. Smith, suddenly started, and a deep blush suffused her neck and forehead. While bowing, I contrived to place my finger on my mouth to indicate I wished no recognition. Mrs. Smith seemed to understand this intuitively, for although it was through her I had originally become acquainted with Arabella, she spoke of us as entire strangers. Arabella herself looked uneasy and discomfited, for, with all her talents, such was her natural candour that she could not support the slightest approach to dissimulation. I myself acted my part but indifferently, and, after several blundering attempts at conversation, speedily sought to compose my nerves by a solitary walk in the garden. While chewing a green twig in a profound reverie, I was attracted to a summer-house by a whisper and a wave of the hand. It was Arabella herself. "I have followed you here at some risk," she said, "for I have been burning to tell you that I have no hand in this base rencounter. It was that odious Mrs. Smith who decoyed me hither, and I knew not that Mrs. Thompson was your aunt till this afternoon. What must you have thought of me? I am infinitely obliged to Mrs. Smith. Nay, do not provoke me, for indeed I am ready to sink with shame and vexation at the vulgar and mean-spirited plot into which I have been led. Your aunt, I see, is a woman of illiberal notions and contracted habits, and Mrs. Smith, with her natural want of all delicacy, brought me hither under false pretences to secure her favour. When I understood this, I could have torn the vile busybody to pieces. A small dose of prussic acid would perhaps be more advisable. No trifling, John, I am serious. Go to your aunt immediately, and tell her the circumstances under which we stand. I can bear the state of duplicity no longer. Dearest and ever noble-minded, to you, as to an angel of light, must my poor earth-bound propensities ever look for exaltation. Deeply as I pity my aunt's illiberalities, henceforth shall I revere her for descrying so speedily your worth. It were in my power at present to deceive her, by affecting to follow her counsel in paying my addresses to you. Nay, start not. I cannot do it for my own sake, and dare not do it for yours. If my own soul could condescend to such meanness, it were unworthy of worshipping thine." So saying, I sought my aunt with all haste, and told her explicitly that her favourite Miss Farquhar was no other than my betrothed. Whether charmed by my candour or by the reciprocity of our tastes, I know not, but my aunt behaved on this occasion in a manner worthy of the sister of my father. Her assistance not only exceeded my expectation, but exceeded my original demand. She even came so far as Glasgow to patronize with her personal presence our wedding. Nor had she ever reason to regret her generosity, for in her declining years Arabella administered to her infirmities like a daughter, and our first-born little boy, William, renewed once more her long-smothered affection, so that the latter days of her life were benignant and blessed as those of its commencement. While living, she would scarcely allow the little rascal out of her sight, and on her death she proved the extent of her love by leaving him all her immense property at my disposal till he came of age, with the exception of only £5,000, which went to the South Sea missions, and a handsome annuity of 30 shillings, which, with some trifling assistance of our own, went to the support of an old housekeeper who had got blind and deaf in her service. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, A Story of Modern Honor, by Lord Morpeth. I was well acquainted with two young men who made their first appearance in the Society of London at about the same period, Lord Oranmore and Mr. Severn. Many things appear to have fallen to the share of each in nearly equal portions, such as considerable wealth, great advantages of personal appearance, and brilliant mental endowments. Upon both it is almost needless to add, the world dawned brightly and smiled kindly. Perhaps, however, the points of difference were even more striking than those of resemblance between them. In the very matter of their good looks, for instance, to which I have alluded, Lord Oranmore was extremely dark, his countenance serious and even stern, his figure lofty and imposing. The complexion of his contemporary was fair, and was particularly remarkable for the open and radiant expression of his features. If I had been writing a tale or novel, I should probably have presented each of them to my reader at once, by informing him that Salvator Rosa would have shadowed the outline of Oranmore beneath one of his shaggy rocks or blighted trees, and that Raphael might have selected Severn for a student in the school of Athens, or a listener in the group round St. Cecilia. I shall perhaps as briefly convey an impression of their moral characteristics by stating that Oranmore was frequently told that in many particulars he bore a close resemblance to Lord Byron, and that Severn had occasionally been admonished by some of his most attached friends that if he did not take very good care he would end in being a saint. The prevailing tone of society may be estimated in some degree from the manner in which these opposite suggestions were received by the parties to whom they were addressed. "You really flatter me too much," modestly protested Lord Oranmore. "I trust not quite that either," sensitively remonstrated Mr. Severn. The same inference might have been drawn from occurrences in their behaviour. Severn unaffectedly wished to be religious, and was in his practice ostentatiously benevolent, but at no time was he ever known to have appeared so grievously annoyed as when he had been casually overheard administering appropriate consolation to a dying servant. And Oranmore upon one occasion spent an entire night at a country house, where he was staying with a large party, in pacing up and down his apartment because he knew that he should be heard underneath, not with the malicious purpose of giving a bad night to the unfortunate tenants of the first floor, for he was by no means an ill-natured person, but that he might gain the credit due to a disturbed conscience and a mysterious remorse. Society, rigidly exclusive as to persons, but amiably lax as to characters, thought fit in the exercise of its high caprice to smile with nearly equal favour on the mitigated demon and qualified angel of my story. It happened consequently that few were the assemblies and dinners at which they did not meet. This most unsought-for frequency of contact brought the natural dissonance of their feelings yet more strikingly into evidence, so that before their first season was half over, they had begun to entertain and even to display toward each other sentiments first of jealousy, then of dislike, in which Oranmore bitterly indulged, and against which Severn sincerely but feebly struggled. In the brilliant career which was opening before them, while success seemed common to both, the spheres of their ascendancy were not precisely the same. Men liked Severn best. Women talked most of Oranmore. Few were the partners who could command attention when his forehead was discerned in the distance, towering above the crowd. Chaperons shrank while they stared, and no servant could ever succeed in getting rid of an ice in the opposite direction. But in politics Severn had a decided advantage. Though both had spoken in the House of Commons with great talent and effect, he was readier, more judicious, and more popular, and perhaps this was brought home to Oranmore's conviction still more forcibly because they happened to be upon the same side, that of opposition. He was therefore obliged to assent, to cheer, and to praise, as well as to envy. But worse remained behind. In love, in the heart of woman, Oranmore's own domain, the star of his rival prevailed. Lady Alice Bohun had refused him, and was now listening with evident satisfaction to the addresses of Severn. About this time an important debate had taken place in the House, and Severn had made a brilliant and most effective speech. The adversary who followed him paid a high compliment to his oratory, and a member who piqued himself upon his independence rose to inform him that it had made him a convert. No success could have been more unequivocal, as Oranmore felt, while the idea annoyed and irritated him. Men are frequently drawn irresistibly on to be witnesses of the triumph at which their very souls sicken, and when Severn stopped in his way home to sup at the club with a cohort of applauding friends, Oranmore sat down at the table with them. Upon his countenance sat a placid, and to him unusual smile. At all events, I shall hear the worst of all they can say in his praise, was his inward rumination. The spirits of those who sat around that board mounted high. The debate had been animated, the division close, the victory on their side, and the wine was abundant. Severn talked most and laughed loudest. Oranmore drank deepest. "By the way, what a lame reply the secretary made to your speech, Severn," said Sir Matthew, pounding. "You had taken it out of him." The orator assented. "I never heard so bad a speech in my whole life." "I cannot quite think that," interposed Oranmore. "I've heard him make better, but I believe a man of his genius could not make a bad one if he tried." "He could not make a bad speech," echoed Sir Matthew. "He could not make a bad speech," re-echoed that patriot company. "Come, come, he has offered Oranmore a place," cried Severn. There was a flush in the cheek, and a flash from the eye, and a quivering on the lip, and the countenance of Oranmore was again placid. "Ministers must go out after this division," said Mr. Pymden. "And who will be sent for in that case?" added Mr. Ham. "Why, Severn is the man for the country," roared out Sir Matthew. "Is not he, Oranmore?" "I wish you would have the goodness, Sir Matthew, not to spill your wine over me." "Don't tell me. Pitt was 2 years younger when he was premier." "Well, if you are minister, Severn, pray remember me," was the postulate of Ham. "And me too," was the corollary of Pymden. "By all means, gentlemen. You, Sir Matthew, shall have the Board of Trade, the colonies for Ham, and Pymden shall be at the Mint. And what place will you choose, Oranmore?" "Place? Place from me?" shouted Oranmore. "And from you, of all mankind, you puppet of a patriot, who, even in the first burst of your shallow popularity, cannot smother your craving for pelf and power? Heyday! What are these heroics, Oranmore?" "They are no heroics, Severn. They are the plainest terms which can suggest themselves to express my unmeasured contempt for your pretensions to patriotism and your assumptions to honesty. It is better to assume anything than the principles of an infidel and the language of a bully. These words, at least, must be answered elsewhere. I shall be found at my lodging." "Oranmore, we are warm, and both have drank too much. We cannot tell what we are doing. Here is my hand." "Ay, take it, Oranmore," said Sir Matthew. "We must not have two of our thoroughgoing ones quarrel. I would not touch it to save his pale soul from hell. Severn, you are a cringing, canting coward." Oranmore left the room. The patriots might possibly have interposed, but Pymden was fast asleep. Ham was dead drunk. Sir Matthew said it would do their side harm if one of them had put up with being called a coward. Mr. MacTaggart of MacTaggart had made it a rule never to mix himself up in such proceedings, and the rest were Irishmen. It was arranged that Sir Matthew, who seemed to be the most sober of the party, should proceed to Lord Oranmore's lodging, and there speedily settle by him and an equally serviceable ally upon the other side, that a meeting should take place at 7 o'clock the next morning in a field behind Hammersmith. Severn, hurried and bewildered, felt a strong desire to see Lady Alice before that decisive rencontre, the necessity of which he rather had passively acquiesced in than deliberately recognized. He remembered that she was then hard by, at Almack's Wednesday ball, and thither accordingly he repaired to find her. There are those among the most well-meaning who frown indiscriminately upon places of gay resort, who maintain that they all unfit the mind alike for graver duties and higher intercourse. I, on the other hand, with unfeigned deference to the sincerity of such opinions, am still inclined to think that, like almost everything else, they may be turned to profit as well as to abuse; that at the crowded assembly, the listening concert, the applauding theatre, emotions may be wakened and watched, associations touched and moulded, opportunities suggested and improved upon, so as to amend and adorn existence. This reflection has arisen from what now took place, as Severn stood in the midst of that full and brilliant room, with his head leaning back upon one of the pillars which support the orchestra. The sights of gaiety and the sounds of harmony which surrounded him produced a sudden revulsion of feeling. The sense of duties, obligations, and hopes became more vivid to his mind, and he half audibly murmured, "I must not shed his blood. God forbid that. I must not let him shed mine." But to mere emotion let no man ever trust. At this moment he saw, through a sudden opening in the throng, Lady Alice Bohun approaching him, bright in attire, radiant with smiles, flushed with the exercise of the dance that was just over, and lovely even beyond her loveliness. She had not perceived him, but was conversing with Lord George Glenern, upon whose arm she leaned with great apparent animation. "Oh, Mr. Severn, I had not seen you before. Thank you, Lord George, this is my place. When did you come, Mr. Severn?" "This very moment. The house has not been up long." "How could I forget to wish you joy upon your speech? The whole room is full of it. They say that it was by far the most beautiful thing that ever was heard, and that but do you know you are not looking well?" "A little knocked up, perhaps. You seem very, very well." "It is a perfect ball. I have just been dancing, too, with Lord George Glenern, and nobody is half so entertaining, though I am almost angry with myself for being so much amused by him. As you know, they told a very ugly story of him 2 or 3 years ago, about his not fighting when he ought." "Lady Alice, I believe I am to have the honour of this dance," interposed a dripping little clerk in the Colonial Office, and up struck the quadrilles in La Dame Blanche. Severn walked home at a rapid pace, flung off his clothes, and then, from the mere force of habit, before stepping into bed, knelt down to pray. That act first recalled to him the power of recollection at least, if not of reflection. 4 or 5 several times, with his fevered head upon his burning hands, he attempted to articulate the accustomed words, but still found in them something that stopped him. "It will not do," he exclaimed, and sprang into bed. He slept instantly and soundly, till roused by Sir Matthew in the morning, with but one determination, not to think. He dressed, allowed himself to be forced to swallow some breakfast, and was seated in the chariot at the side of his friend. "Well, I will say, however, I never saw a fellow cooler in life," observed the admiring baronet. "Only have the goodness not to talk to me," was the somewhat ungrateful rejoinder. The injunction produced its effect for 5 minutes, when Sir Matthew took a hint from some piece of ground which they passed, and launched off into a circumstantial detail of all the political duels which had occurred in his time, and which, as it entailed no interchange of communication, Severn allowed to proceed without further interruption. When they arrived upon the ground, they found their antagonists in readiness. The seconds made the necessary arrangements, and the principals took their places, exchanging at the time signs of haughty but calm recognition. They had entertained for each other, since the period of their first acquaintance, feelings of distaste, if not ill will. They had now met for the most hostile purpose that can bring human creatures together, yet they had probably never before experienced so little of mutual repugnance. Oranmore felt that he had been the most to blame in the original quarrel, and Severn condemned no one but himself for his present position. A signal was given. Severn fired steadily, but without being observed, into the air. The shot of Oranmore did not take effect. It had been determined by the seconds that, after language of so little qualified a character, the honour of the parties required the purifying ordeal of a second fire, supposing the first to have been ineffectual. Fresh pistols were accordingly supplied, and a second signal given with great rapidity, which entirely precluded the combatants from taking either aim or thought. Oranmore missed again, but received in his breast the bullet of Severn. He fell flat and heavy. Where are the words to tell what the moment was when that sight crossed the eyes of his opponent? The wounded man was put upon a plank and carried into an adjoining farmhouse. The surgeon in attendance announced that he would not live above an hour. Oranmore, who retained entire possession of all his faculties, heard the intelligence, and immediately asked for Severn. "He is standing by your bed. We could not get him to leave you. Come near to me, Severn. Take my hand. I refused yours last night. You must forgive me for having led you into this scene of horror. The blame is mine. I am very weak, and you must take measures for escape. Live, live, if you would not make me miserable, mad. Live to rescue my soul from guilt and anguish, from blood and murder. Live that I may devote my life to serve, to appreciate you, to make atonement to you. Live to save and bless me. I know not what I say or think. Live, but live, brave and gifted Oranmore. Here he was absolutely forced into the carriage by Sir Matthew, but he had at least the consolation of learning afterwards that his victim died, it might be hoped insincere, because it appeared in abject penitence. He heard his companion arrange the whole plan of his flight, and even expressed his acquiescence, but when he perceived that, having absolved his mind upon this point, that exemplary politician was about to enter upon an enumeration of the probable divisions he would miss, and more especially to regret that he would not be able to bear any part in an important motion of Ham's which stood for the next Tuesday, there was something in his countenance which awed even Sir Matthew into silence. Upon their arrival in town, while Sir Matthew, more pleased to be of active service than in close contact with so unsociable a remorse, was occupied in hastening some necessary arrangements for the safe departure of his friend, he proceeded himself, regardless of the danger which he thus incurred, to the residence of Lady Alice, and requested to see her alone. I am come, Lady Alice, to take leave of you. Leave, Mr. Severn? You are not going away for long, I hope. If it can give you pain, it even adds to the concern, the deep concern I now feel. I'm going away for ever. No, you would not have come here to tell me that. But your looks, oh, for mercy's sake, what has happened? He told her. She appeared deeply shocked, and it was some time before she could say anything. I am grieved, extremely grieved. It is most melancholy, dreadful. Poor Lord Oranmore, such youth and beauty. I pity him sincerely, and I, in many, many respects, as sincerely envy him. But you must not be too much borne down by it. I do not well see how it could have been avoided. I must beg of you, do not attempt to excuse me. You must not really take it too deeply to heart. It is most unfortunate, but only consider how much worse it would have been if you had refused to fight. Does the reader remember that beautiful passage in Lord Byron, where Conrad, the man of combats, shudders at the stain upon the forehead of Gulnare? That spot of blood, that light but guilty streak, had banished all the beauty from her cheek. Blood he had viewed, could view unmoved, but then it flowed in combat, or was shed by men. What that spot was to the Corsair were the last words of Lady Alice to Severn. She stood before him after she had uttered them, beautiful, feminine, and patrician as ever, but he had ceased to worship, and the shrine had lost its idol. Perhaps it was good for him that it should be thus, and the few hasty syllables which dropped from the lips of her he most admired may have given what otherwise he might have wanted, strength and constancy in parting. It was 4 or 5 years after these occurrences that I met Severn in a maritime town of the Levant. I had been well acquainted with him in London, had always felt a strong attraction toward him, and now partially and by degrees succeeded in obtaining his confidence. That sacred trust I do not here violate. England, he once said to me, I feel myself incapable of ever revisiting, memories enough without memorials. But if in the detail of what I have done and suffered anything is to be found that might either teach or warn, I should look upon the disclosure as part of the reparation which it is now the object of my life to make. Upon quitting England, he had enlisted himself in one of those bands that were then first raising the standard of Grecian independence in the Morea, a cause for which individual Englishmen had felt keenly and fought bravely, but upon which I fear that as a nation we have looked but coldly. Severn was one of those who could be liberal abroad as well as at home, but after an engagement in which he had greatly distinguished himself, he felt that from human blood he now recoiled with horror. He fancied that he had traced in the distorted features of an expiring Mussulman the last look of Oranmore, and he resolved that a hand, red as he termed it, with the murder of a countryman, was not worthy of joining in the struggle of the patriots against a foreign enemy. He withdrew to a commercial town on the Asiatic side of the archipelago, where, having changed his name and diverted to charitable uses his remittances from England, he earned his bread by teaching English and Latin to a motley collection of Frank and Greek scholars, occasionally including some high-born scion of consular descent. I took more than one occasion, after having seen him plodding the same weary round of minute employment, wrestling patiently and perseveringly with dullness, idleness, and insolence, ringing the changes of ignoble praise and commonplace rebuke, to remonstrate with him, the high-bred, the energetic, the refined, thus wasting qualities and dispositions so eminent upon an employment so inadequate, cramping, and humiliating. Take not away from me, he replied, what you call my humiliations. They are the only things on earth at least that reconcile me to myself. Two little traits connected with his present mode of life are all that occurs to me further to record. One day, one single day, exhibited an exception to his ordinary behavior. He was observed in the discharge of his usual labors to be irritable, capricious, and morose. Tidings had happened to reach him that morning, announcing the intended marriage of Lady Alice Bohun to Lord George Glenern. Upon another occasion, a young Greek who had been his pupil, and who retained for him that deference amounting to veneration, which under his present chastened yet loftier character, it would have been almost a miracle not to feel, asked his opinion respecting the lawfulness of private combat. I quote his answer: "Whether the future laws of your restored country will permit or connive at such a practice, I cannot pretend to anticipate. Persuaded I am that the whole spirit of the higher law, to which we both profess allegiance, unequivocally forbids it. You may attempt to assure yourself that your own hand at least shall be free from blood-guiltiness. I will go on in a moment. How can you answer to yourself for permitting, enabling, assisting your fellow creature to incur that charge? I do not tell you to despise or to defy the world. Deserve and enjoy the fair opinion while you may. But if the alternative should present itself, if the preference must be given, you may believe, one who has a right to speak upon the subject, that it is a better and a happier thing to be its outcast than its slave." End of section 4. Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. Natural Affection. A writer in one of our Southern papers, combating the common idea that there exists an instinctive affection which would attach to each other relatives who were unconscious of the fact, and by the force of which friends long separated might instantly recognize each other, cites the following characteristic anecdote of our illustrious countryman Franklin as a proof of the truth of his arguments. Dr. Benjamin Franklin, after the decease of his father, returned to Boston in order to pay his respects to his mother, who resided in that city. He had been absent some years, and at that period of his life when the greatest and most rapid alteration is made in the human appearance, at a time when the querulous voice of the stripling assumes the commanding tone of the adult, and the smiling features of youth are succeeded by the strong line of manhood. The doctor was sensible, such was the alteration of his person, that his mother could not know him except by that instinct which, it is believed, can cause a mother's heart to beat violently in the presence of a child, and point the maternal eye with quick and sudden glance to a beloved son. To discover the existence of this instinct by actual experience, the doctor resolved to introduce himself as a stranger to his mother, and to watch narrowly for the moment in which she should discover her son, and then to determine, with the cool precision of the philosopher, whether that discovery was the effect of that instinct of affection, that intuitive love, that innate attachment which is conjectured to cement relatives of the same blood, and which, by according the passions of parent and child, like a well-tuned viol, would at the first touch cause them to vibrate in unison, and at once evince that they were different chords of the same instrument. On a sullen, chilly day in the month of January, in the afternoon, the doctor knocked at his mother's door and asked to speak with Mrs. Franklin. He found the old lady knitting before the parlor fire, introduced himself by observing that he had been informed she entertained travellers, and requested a night's lodging. She eyed him with that cold look of disapprobation which most people assume when they imagine themselves insulted by being supposed to exercise an employment but one degree below their real occupation in life, assured him that he had been misinformed, that she did not keep travellers, but that it was true, to oblige some members of the legislature, she took a number of them into her family during the session, that she then had 4 members of the council and 6 of the House of Representatives who then boarded with her, that all her beds were full, and then betook herself to her knitting with the intent application which expressed as forcibly as action could do if you have concluded your business, the sooner you leave the house the better. But upon the doctor's wrapping his coat around him, affecting to shiver with cold, and observing that it was very chilly weather, she pointed to a chair and gave him leave to warm himself. The entrance of the boarders precluded all further conversation. Coffee was soon served, and the doctor partook with the family. To the coffee, according to the good old custom of the times, succeeded a plate of pippins, pipes, and a paper of Macintyre's best, when the whole family formed a cheerful smoking semicircle before the fire. Perhaps no man ever possessed the colloquial powers of a more fascinating degree than Dr. Franklin, and never was there an occasion when he displayed those powers to greater advantage than at this time. He drew the attention of the company by the solidity of modest remark, instructed them by varied new and striking lights in which he placed his subject, and delighted them with apt and amusing anecdotes. Thus employed, the hours passed merrily along until 8 o'clock, when punctually to a moment Mrs. Franklin announced supper. Busied with her household affairs, she fancied the intruding stranger had quitted the house immediately after coffee, and it was with difficulty she could restrain her resentment when she saw him, without molestation, seat himself at the table with the freedom of a member of the family. Immediately after supper she called an elderly gentleman, a member of the council, in whom she was accustomed to confide, to another room, complained bitterly of the rudeness of the stranger, told the manner of his introduction to the house, observed that he appeared like an outlandish man, and she thought had something very suspicious in his appearance, concluding by soliciting her friend's advice with respect to the way in which she should most easily rid herself of his presence. The old gentleman assured her that the stranger was certainly a young man of education, and to all appearance a gentleman, that perhaps being in agreeable company, he had paid no attention to the lateness of the hour, and advised her to call him aside and repeat to him her inability to lodge him. She accordingly sent her maid to him, and then, with as much temper as she could command, recapitulated the situation of her family, observed that it grew late, and mildly intimated that he would do well to seek himself a lodging. The doctor replied that he would by no means incommode her family, but that with her leave he would smoke one pipe more with her boarders, and then retire. He returned to the company, filled his pipe, and with the first whiff, his powers of converse returned with double force. He recounted the hardships, he extolled the piety of their ancestors. A gentleman present mentioned the subject of the day's debate in the House of Representatives. A bill had been introduced to extend the prerogative of the royal governor. The doctor immediately entered upon this subject, supported the colonial rights with new and forcible arguments, was familiar with the names of the influential men of the House when Dudley was governor, recited their speeches, and applauded the noble defense of the Chamber of Rights. During the discourse, so appropriately interesting to the company, no wonder that the clock struck 11 unperceived by the delighted circle, nor was it wonderful that the patience of Mrs. Franklin by this time grew quite exhausted. She now entered the room, and before the whole company with much warmth addressed the doctor, told him plainly she thought herself imposed on, observing that it was true she was a lone woman, but that she had friends who would protect her, and concluded by insisting on his leaving the house. The doctor made a slight apology, deliberately put on his great coat and hat, took a polite leave of the company, and approached the street door, lighted by the maid and attended by the mistress. While the doctor and his companions had been employing themselves within, a most tremendous snowstorm had filled the street knee-deep, and no sooner had the maid lifted up the latch than a roaring northeaster forced open the door, extinguished the light, and almost filled the entry with drifted snow and hail. As soon as the candle was relighted, the doctor cast a woeful look toward the door, and thus addressed his mother: "My dear madam, can you turn me out of your house in this dreadful storm? I'm a stranger in this town, and shall certainly perish in the streets. You look like a charitable lady. I shouldn't think you could turn a dog from your door on this tempestuous night." "Don't tell me of charity," said the offended matron. "Charity begins at home. It is your own fault you tarried so long. To be plain with you, sir, I do not like your looks or your conduct, and I fear you have some bad design in thus introducing yourself to my family." The warmth of the parley had drawn the company from the parlor, and by their united interference the stranger was permitted to lodge in the house, as no bed could be had. He consented to repose on an easy chair before the parlor fire. Although her boarders appeared to confide in the stranger's honesty, it was not so with Mrs. Franklin. With suspicious caution she collected her silver spoons, pepper box, and porringer from her closet, and after securing the parlor door by sticking a fork over the latch, carried the plate to the chamber, charged the negro man to sleep with his clothes on, and to take the great cleaver to bed with him, and to waken and seize the vagrant at the first noise he made in attempting to plunder. Having thus taken every precaution, she retired to bed with her maid, whom she compelled to sleep in her room. Mrs. Franklin rose before the sun, roused her domestics, and found the stranger quietly sleeping in the chair. A sudden transition from extreme mistrust to perfect confidence was natural. She awakened him with a cheerful good morning, inquiring how he had rested, and invited him to partake of her breakfast, which was always served previous to that of her boarders. "And pray, sir," said the old lady, as she sipped her chocolate, "as you appear to be a stranger here, to what distant country do you belong?" "I, madam, belong to the city of Philadelphia." At the mention of Philadelphia, the doctor declared he for the first time perceived any emotion in her. "Philadelphia," said she, and all the mother suffused her eye. "If you live in Philadelphia, perhaps you know my Ben." "Who, madam?" "Why, Ben Franklin, my Ben." "Oh, he is the dearest child that ever blessed a mother." "What!" said the doctor, "is Ben Franklin, the printer, your son?" "Why, he is my most intimate friend. He and I lodge in the same room." "Oh, God forgive me!" exclaimed the old lady, raising her watery eyes to heaven. "And have I suffered an acquaintance of my Benny to sleep in this hard chair, while I myself rested on a good bed?" How the doctor discovered himself to his mother he has not informed us, but from the above experiments he was firmly convinced, and was often afterwards heard to declare that natural affection does not exist. End of Section 5.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. The Unbusied Shepherd, by Hill. The unbusied shepherd, stretched beneath the hawthorn, his careless limbs thrown out in wanton ease, with thoughtless gaze perusing the arched heavens, and idly whistling, while his sheep fed round him, enjoys a sweeter shade than that of canopies, hemmed in by care, and shook by storms of treason. End of Section 6, recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 7 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kate Follis. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7. Marcus Bell, the Convict, by Leitch, Ritchie. I chanced to be present at the trial of this young man and his companions, and was rather wearied than interested by the detail of the daring yet common crimes of which they had been guilty. A female witness, however, at length aroused my attention, not by her beauty, so much lauded by the newspapers, but by a singularity of manner which escaped the observation of all the reporters, with one exception. Her calmness appeared to me to have something of desperation. When desired to look at the prisoner, Bell, she obeyed, but her glance was instantaneously withdrawn, and never again returned to the same object. When going out of the court, the same young woman passed me, pale and composed no more, but with flushed cheeks, and crushing her fingers within each other, as if to counteract some agony of the mind, by physical pain. I addressed her, I could not help it, and the rather that it was so public a thoroughfare as the Old Bailey, and in broad daylight, when malice itself could not suspect me of improper motives in speaking to one of her shameful and degraded caste. The information I obtained from her induced me to visit the convict in prison, and the story which, by the aid of her hints, I drew from him, seems to me to be not unworthy of record. Be it observed that I wish to excite no sympathy for Bell. A penal colony is the best place for such desperadoes, and his punishment was as just as his guilt was manifest. It appears that Marcus Bell was born in Chester, and that his family was respectable, though far from being rich. After his father's death, his mother let the greater part of her house in lodgings, and her son, the only child, was sent to an attorney's office. The lad, if I may believe his own account, was naturally shy and modest. He had few acquaintances, and as he grew up was long unsullied by those vices of youth which are leniently called follies. When he had commenced his 19th year, his mother, for the first time, received an actor in her house as a lodger. It would have been well for her had she still suffered herself to be mastered by the prejudices which had hitherto excluded persons of this calling from her apartments. But the conduct of the individual in question, a Mr. Haswell, was rather calculated to raise the whole body in his opinion. He was a quiet, temperate, respectable man, and Mrs. Bell repented the injustice she had done to the players. Marcus speedily became a favourite with Mr. Haswell, and the latter evidenced his goodwill by giving his young friend a free admission to the theatre as often as he chose to make use of it. I am not one of the saints, and if I were, I do not think I should believe that immoral or irreligious feeling are necessarily excited by a visit to the theatre. But there are some orders of mind on which some amusements, without of themselves lowering their tone, act in a manner that is highly mischievous. They resemble an intoxicating drink, which raises him who indulges in it above the low realities of life, and which is the more tempting to the victim from the fine and generous thoughts that garnish like flowers the fatal bowl. But, unlike such drinks, the effect of the stage continues, and is not a mere alternative of action and reaction. The amateur finds himself in a false position in the world. He is disgusted with the details of business. His future is not a speculation founded upon induction, but the baseless fabric of a vision. Marcus Bell, to the great distress of his mother, became a constant attendant at the theatre, and in the same proportion he relaxed in his attention to the duties of the office, till various quarrels with his employer became the consequence. But it is necessary to notice in the first place a still more important result of the new passion that had beset him. Free admissions are always given to the boxes, and there Bell found himself in the midst of that class of society whence are usually taken the heroes and heroines of the drama. Among these he saw for the first time that unfortunate lady whose name is only too well known to the public, Amelia Gray, and felt toward her, as he asserts, the moment their eyes met, that species of attraction which almost seems to invest their subsequent connection with a character of fatality. Miss Gray had lost her mother in infancy, and being an only child was the spoiled pet of her father, a gentleman of some property in the neighbourhood. Her education was entrusted to an elderly lady of perfect respectability, but of too easy a disposition, and the predilections she exhibited for dramatic amusements was, therefore, permitted to strengthen itself as she grew older by uncontrolled indulgence. It is not to be supposed that the boxes in a provincial town were usually so crowded as to prevent Miss Grey from distinguishing individuals. By and by she came to expect to see young Bell, and the flush which her tacit recognition sent to his brow was soon reflected on her own. As the story enacted before them went on, they read stealthily in each other's eyes the criticisms of the heart, and more especially at those outbursts of devoted passion which the drama delights to exhibit as rending away the artificial barriers of society. Their glances bespoke something far deeper than the sympathy of an amateur, and thus they became acquainted, exchanging looks and thoughts instead of words, and suffering the sentiments which at their age are in the course of formation to grow and ripen in the heated atmosphere of a playhouse. This new passion, for it became such, was fatal to the prospects of the youth. The very quietness and taciturnity of his disposition operated against him. The romantic ideas which had beset him having no opportunity of being rubbed off in the collision of social life. He passed his time in a dream. The shadows of imagination were realities to him, the realities of the world, shadows. He came at length to believe that Amelia and he were destined for each other, and the absurd delusion was so strong that even the shock of being turned out of his employment for indolence in the discharge of its mechanical duties did not awaken him. After this he spent the greater part of his time in rambling about the country, for home became insufferable from the grief and reproaches of his mother, and he had no idle acquaintances. But soon he was not always alone. Mr. Gray's park was his favourite haunt, and poor Amelia was accustomed to repair every day with her work, more frequently a romance, in her hand, to a nook in one of the richest glades, which she called her boudoir. For many days she was not aware that he with whom in all probability her thoughts were busy at the moment, but whose very name she was unacquainted with, was close by the path, concealed in the shrubbery, where Damon kneeling worshipped as she passed. He at length, however, ventured in her sight, in that portion of the park which was open to the public, although the first time it was with his eyes bent upon the ground, and his face covered with burning blushes. Gradually they grew accustomed to the presence of each other. They exchanged looks, glances of recognition, words, and finally the two intimate and confidential friends became acquainted. I must hurry over the result of their fatal meetings. Sacred be love from sight, whate'er it is. Let it be imagined that the boudoir was their trysting place, that they talked treason against society and its rigid laws, that they read together books of dangerous passion, and that at length a time came when the world was all forgot, the struggle o'er, desperate the joy, that day they read no more. I have no intention to elevate vice by making it sentimental. The above were actually the steps that led to this unhappy connection. They indicate weakness on both sides, and an imprudence on the part of Miss Grey, which was the result of a neglected education. But I confess I do not see any very egregious symptoms of that early depravity of which Bell is accused. Perhaps the disclosure I have to make myself is the worst thing in this portion of his history. It is that he looked forward to the consequences of their love as a means of compelling Mr. Grey to accept him as a son-in-law. But even this, which at first sight appears so mean and cruel, arose from those false views of the social state which were indulged both by Amelia and him. when the situation of the young lady became at length apparent, the decisive moment had arrived, but it was a moment which, however long contemplated, Marcus was far from being prepared to meet. Everything had appeared easy at a distance, but when the time came when he was actually to wait upon Mr. Gray for the purpose of demanding his daughter in marriage, he shrunk back in alarm. He feared that he had made a miscalculation. Would one of the first men in the neighborhood really think that he snatched his daughter from destruction by marrying her to the ex-clerk of an attorney? Would his visit answer any other purpose than that of adding insult to injury by telling the father that he had seduced his only child and intended heiress? The film of romance fell from the eyes of Marcus Bell, and he looked with anguish and remorse upon her whom he now termed his victim, as she stood pale and terror-stricken before him, watching his decision. Mr. Gray was a rich man, and had high notions of family consequence, so high indeed that the idea of such a circumstance as had now taken place could not have occurred to him at all as within the range of possibility. But on the other hand, he was dotingly fond of his daughter. The question then was whether love or rage would gain the mastery, whether he would sacrifice his prospects of family aggrandizement to Amelia's happiness, or sacrifice Amelia herself to his revenge. After numerous consultations, it was determined that Bell should put the matter to the proof, and one day, leaving his mistress trembling and nearly fainting in her shady boudoir, he proceeded to the house to demand an interview with its master. It was arranged that, whatever might be the issue of the adventure, he was to return to bring the news himself to Amelia. Marcus was admitted, and with a sinking heart and trembling limbs, found himself actually waiting in the library for the approach of Mr. Gray. He heard his voice, he counted his footsteps as they came near, but when at length he saw the handle of the door turn, the young man could no longer withstand the horror of his situation, but sunk, gasping, upon a chair. I cannot tell in what manner he explained himself, for Bell declared to me that he lost every recollection of the details of the interview the moment it was over. He only recollected, for that could not pass from his memory, being dragged by the neck from the room and along the passage and kicked like a dog out of the house. He did not return to the wood. He included even Amelia herself in the imprecations that burst from his heart. At that moment he could have murdered her. He went straight home, reeling like a drunken man, broke open his mother's desk, and finding no money, for she had gone out to market with her slender purse, cut into the lodger's, his friend Mr. Haswell's, portmanteau, and abstracting from it between 5 and 6 pounds, took a place on a coach just starting for London, and threw himself upon the world. It cannot be said that his feelings ever returned to their usual level. When at last he could think calmly, however desperately, he regretted that he had not taken leave of Amelia. As for the robbery, when he thought at all of that, it was, as he expressed it, with a kind of awful exultation. His mother, he knew, would have to make up the money, but this would be to purchase cheaply the absence of a burden which weighed upon her energies like the nightmare. His exultation arose from the idea that he had made the first plunge into the gulf to which he was destined, and this frightful fancy was but too natural in his situation. He had no friends, no money, no character, no profession. He had abjured the rank in which he had been placed by birth and education, and had been spurned with scorn and indignation from the one to which he had aspired. What hope was there for him in a world where substance could be gained only by fraud or labor? What resources but to take what he could not earn? But these delusions were for a long time known to be such. They were ramifications of the wild dream in which Amelia and he had indulged, and he at first gave himself up to them as an amusement for his imagination in the midst of the terrible realities by which he was now surrounded. But this new drag became a habit like the former. He had learnt to receive pleasure from the idea of crime, and although he husbanded his small resources with penurious care, and continued to seek such employment as he was fit for, with constant though hopeless assiduity, it was without any fierce emotion he at length found himself at that point where the alternative was to beg for the means of subsistence, or to take them either by fraud or force. The career of this unhappy youth in London is familiar to the public, and I do not think it necessary here, for the purpose of bringing down this history, to go again over its details. I may state, however, as a circumstance not hitherto mentioned, that the remarkable success which for a time attended him is attributed by himself to the fact that he never employed or otherwise placed himself in the power of any female accomplice. His love for Amelia was unchanged, and this extraordinary passion preserved even the felon outlaw from the contamination of debauchery. I am inclined to think, however, for my days of romance are well nigh past, that if his love had been more pure, if Amelia had been the object of some delicate and virtuous attachment, the same effect would not have been produced. She, in fact, took the place in his imagination of the more vulgar mistresses of his comrades, and in proportion as his uninformed and misdirected mind was more refined than theirs, her influence was greater. A platonic attachment, besides, could not have subsisted at all in the midst of guilt like his, for the hope of being reunited to its object, which was actually the anchor of his heart, could not have endured for a moment. But it is needless to load this little narrative with such speculations. The fact is certain that it was his intention to return and carry off his mistress, by fraud or force, as soon as he had realized a sum sufficient to enable him to emigrate in comfort to the Cape of Good Hope. This sum, amounting to rather more than £600, he actually did realize, and his place was taken by the coach to Chester. He was at this time connected with a gang of housebreakers, small in number, but of a very daring and desperate character, and the night preceding his journey to the country was to be employed in a deed which would produce about £200 each. This was the robbery of the house of Mr. Hillsweather in Baker Street. The desperadoes remarked to each other that there was nothing criminal in the enterprise, because Mr. Hillsweather was a young man of fashion, who was lavishing his fortune as fast as he could upon courtesans and blacklegs, and there was certainly little or nothing perilous, as they had an accomplice within the house, and an entrance was not to be made till at least an hour after the departure of its master for Newmarket. On that evening he was to entertain a small party of select friends of both sexes, and set out at midnight on his journey. Notwithstanding these favorable circumstances, Marcus Bell had a misgiving, as he alleges, for which he could not account. He was more than once upon the point of declaring off, but the amount of the booty was tempting, and the time passed in hesitation till it was too late to withdraw. This feeling may be accounted for without having recourse to superstition. On the very next morning he was to set out to rejoin Miss Grey, and it was no wonder that he should have shrunk with unconscious terror from a new deed of such a nature. As the moment approached for revisiting Chester, he had been tortured by 1,000 doubts and fears. He had sent occasionally a little money to his mother, but without giving his address, and had not heard one syllable from or of any human being in the district. He thought it more than probable that Amelia's disgrace had been cloaked by her family. What might not have occurred in the course of 18 months? Perhaps she was now married to another. But if cast off, in the frenzied rage of the moment, by her father, what had become of her? Weak, ignorant, amiable, and beautiful, where could she look for safety? What were the principles she possessed to balance her inexperience? Marcus, ruffian as he was, groaned in spirit as the last query suggested itself, summoning the shapes of memory like accusing spirits before him. The time for action arrived, and the robbers met without interruption at the spot. All went well. Mr. Hillsweather and his friends had set out on their journey, the whole party in a state of intoxication. If any remained in the house, which was improbable, they could hardly be in a condition to perceive the intrusion, or, if they were, to give the alarm. The night was dark. They had not met a single officer of police since they passed Portman Square. Their accomplice, one of the inferior servants, who had not accompanied his master, was faithful. The area gate was opened gently, and the ruffians entered one by one in silence and unobserved. The gang separated in the hall as had been agreed, each to pursue his separate duty, and Bell mounted the stairs to penetrate to the master's bedchamber, where the principal part of the money was expected to be found. He looked into several rooms as he passed, and by the light of his lantern observed evident traces of the riot and debauchery of which they had been the scene some hours before. Broken glasses, wine spilt on the satin covers, fragments of female dress, attested the nature of the orgies. He passed on, and with his lantern in one hand and a cocked pistol in the other, entered the principal bedroom. All was profoundly silent, and yet it was evident that the bed was not untenanted, for some handsome female clothing lay upon the chairs near it, as if lately put off by the sleeper. Bell hesitated for a moment, but was presently reassured by the idea that one of the female guests had been left behind, in consequence of having drank to excess. He advanced gently, however, till on the light of the lantern, penetrating the shady hollow of the curtains, he saw that the tenant of the bed was already in a sitting posture, watching breathlessly his approach. His first thought was to command silence, his first motion to threaten her with the pistol, but his tongue clove to his mouth. His hand fell lifelessly by his side. He felt as if stunned, he knew not how. Images of horror, without form or void, pressed upon his brain. This was but for a moment. The female sprang from the bed, and putting back her hair from her brow, gazed upon him with eyes of almost insane wonder and expectation. "Man, what are you?" at length broke in a whisper from her white lips, as Amelia bent toward her lover without daring to approach him. "I am a thief," replied Marcus Bell hoarsely. "And you?" I am a harlot." She fainted and fell upon the floor, and at that instant the pistol in the robber's hand, forgotten in the terrible emotion of the scene, exploded. The servants, aroused by the report, succeeded in capturing 2 of the ruffians, and on reaching the bedroom they found Miss Grey sitting upon the floor with her face covered with her dishevelled hair, buried in her hands, and Marcus Bell standing at a little distance with his arms crossed upon his bosom, gazing upon the ruin he had made. To the above narrative, which may be depended upon as substantially correct, I have only to add that soon after Bell's flight from Chester, Mr. Grey died and left his daughter without a shilling. The conviction that her lover had deserted her from mercenary motives, added to the usual circumstances which act so fatally upon characters like hers, had led to her present degraded situation. I cannot forbear to mention, however, as a thing connected with those mysteries of the female heart, which a man is incapable of understanding, that although she never visited Bell in prison, or saw him since that terrible recognition, except on the trial, I find in the list of emigrants to the colony to which he is to be transported the name of Amelia Grey. End of section 7.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 13, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8, Wyoming, by Fitz Halleck. Thou comest in beauty on my gaze at last, on Susquehanna's side, fair Wyoming, image of many a dream in hours long past, when life was in its bud and blossoming, and waters gushing from the fountain spring of pure enthusiast thought dimmed my young eyes, as by the poet borne on unseen wing, I breathed in fancy 'neath thy cloudless skies the summer's air, and heard her echoed harmonies. I then but dreamed, thou art before me now, in life a vision of the brain no more. I've stood upon the wooded mountain's brow, that beetles high thy lovely valley o'er. And now, where winds thy river's greenish shore, within a bower of sycamores am laid, and winds as soft and sweet as ever bore the fragrance of wild flowers through sun and shade, are singing in the trees whose low boughs press my head. Nature hath made thee lovelier than the power even of Campbell's pen hath pictured. He had woven, bad he gazed one sunny hour, upon thy smiling vale its scenery with more of truth, and made each rock and tree known like old friends, and greeted from afar. And there their tales of sad reality, in the dark legends of thy border war, with woes of deeper tint than his own Gertrude's are. But where are they, the beings of the mind, the bard's creations, moulded not of clay, hearts to strange bliss and suffering assigned? Young Gertrude, Albert, Waldegrave, where are they? We need not ask. The people of today appear good, honest, quiet men enough, and hospitable too for ready pay, with manners like their roads, a little rough, and hands whose grasp is warm and welcoming, though tough. Judge Hallenbach, who keeps the toll-bridge gates and the town records, is the Albert now of Wyoming, like him in church and state her Doric column, and upon his brow the thin hairs, white with 70 winters' snow, look patriarchal. Waldegrave 'twere in vain to point out here, unless in yon scarecrow that stands full uniformed upon the plain to frighten flocks of crows and blackbirds from the grain. For he would look particularly droll in his Iberian boot and Spanish plume, and be the wonder of each Christian soul, as of the birds that scare crow and his broom. But Gertrude, in her loveliness and bloom, hath many a model here, for woman's eye, in court or cottage, wheresoe'er her home, hath a heart spell too holy and too high, to be o'erpraised even by her worshipper, Poesy. There's one in the next field, of sweet 16, singing and summoning thoughts of beauty born in heaven, with her jacket of light green, love-darting eyes and tresses like the morn, without a shoe or stocking, hoeing corn. Whether, like Gertrude, she oft wanders there, with Shakespeare's volume in her bosom borne, I think is doubtful. Of the poet-player, the maiden knows no more than Cobbett or Voltaire. There is a woman, widowed, grey and old, who tells you where the foot of battle stepped upon their day of massacre. She told its tale and pointed to the spot and wept, whereon her father and 5 brothers slept shroudless, the bright dream slumbers of the brave, when all the land a funeral mourning kept. And there wild laurels planted on the grave by nature's hand, in air their pale red blossoms wave. And on the margin of yon orchard hill are marks where time-worn battlements have been, and in the tall grass traces linger still of arrowy frieze and wedged ravelin. 500 of her brave that valley green trod on the morn in soldier spirit gay, but 20 lived to tell the noonday scene, and where are now the 20? Passed away. Has death no triumph hours, save on the battle day? End of section 8, recording by Alan Mapstone. End of the Rover Volume 1 number 13, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.